Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is Smarter News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our Smarter series features unique people who help us think and live smarter. February 22nd marks the birth date of America's first president. Born in 1732 in Virginia, George Washington grows up to lead the Continental Army and then the nation. His birthday was celebrated unofficially for years and became a federal holiday in the late 1800s. In fact, Washington's birthday is the official federal holiday we all share every year on the third Monday of February. But the bookends of his life, the stories of his youth and his post-presidency years remain less well told. What image do you have of President Washington in retirement? I never think of him relaxing at his home in Mount Vernon. I always picture him in his uniform, strong and stately, always above the political fray. And that picture, shared by many, may not be the most accurate, as author Jonathan Horn discovered. Jonathan wrote the new book, Washington's End, The Final Years and the Forgotten Struggle. And he provides a snapshot of the president's life that few have dived into. So my first question for Jonathan, why title the book in that way? What's the forgotten struggle of President Washington? Let's just start with the title, Jonathan, because I was sort of interested in that choice, Washington's End, The Final Years, and the Forgotten Struggle. Why title the book in that way? What is the forgotten struggle of President Washington?
Well, I think the forgotten struggle goes back to the title. It's Washington's End because the last years of George Washington's life so rarely make it into books about George Washington. George Washington did so much earlier in his life with the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, the Constitutional Convention, 2 terms as president. And by the time you get through all that, you don't really have time for what happened after his presidency. But it was a really interesting period of his life, and that's why I wanted to tell the last years of his life. We all sort of know that he wanted to give up power at the end of his presidency and return to Mount Vernon and live out his days as a farmer. And it wasn't so easy to do that, and that's the forgotten struggle. The forgotten struggle is the struggle to give up power. He knows his legacy depends on giving up power, and it was much harder than he ever anticipated.
And why was that?
I think there were so many different personalities and people trying to pull George Washington back into the political fray, and eventually they succeeded a little bit more than a year after George Washington left the presidency. So in 1798, America and France are on the edge of war, and the then sitting president, John Adams, will call George Washington and ask him to accept command of the United States armies, and actually gives him the title Commander-in-Chief of the armies of the United States. Now, you know that the title Commander-in-Chief belongs to the president, technically. So all of a sudden you have 2 commanders-in-chief, and to no one's surprise, soon George Washington and John Adams are in a serious feud over control of the army.
And so what happened? Because I had this image of President Washington sort of sitting on his porch looking at the sunset in his retirement, not necessarily battling the current president about whether or not he is going to step into the role of military leadership again.
And I think this is a really key point, because that's exactly the way George Washington wanted to live out his final years. He wanted to return to Mount Vernon. He wanted to be a farmer, which he always felt was his real calling in life, to be a farmer. He wanted to put his house in order. He wanted to put his old papers in order because he knew historians were going to one day be interested. And he wanted to really separate himself from what was happening in Philadelphia. But part of him still really needed to know what was happening back in the capital, which was then Philadelphia. And he needed to know, and he voraciously read newspapers, and he pressed people in Adams's cabinet to send information about what was happening, because he needed to know. And why did he need to know? Because he had created this country. It was all his legacy, and it's really difficult to give up control.
So what eventually happened between President Washington and President Adams?
So George Washington eventually decided he wanted to have Alexander Hamilton as his second in command of the army. And it so happened that the one person who John Adams did not want to have be second in command of this army was Alexander Hamilton. Washington and Adams get into a very serious feud over this subject, and eventually Washington threatens to resign if he doesn't get his way. So Adams has to give way because he can't have Washington resign from the army. So I think that we're talking so much about the struggle between Washington and Adams, and it's important to say for context that this struggle is nowhere near as bad as the struggle that Washington had with Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, who are your third, fourth, and fifth presidents of the United States. George Washington didn't live to see any of those presidencies, and it's probably for the best, because by the time he died in 1799, he was no longer even on speaking terms with those three men.
Now, wait a minute. We're deep into the social media space right now. So when a former president, for example, takes to Twitter, the current president, as we know, sometimes likes to recognize that, and there can be a little bit of tension on social media. But how did this actually happen in the 1790s? When you're saying that there's disagreements, are there letters? Were they just writing to each other furiously? How were these conversations or tensions playing out?
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because we think about our era as having new forms of communication. Well, their era had new forms of communication too, partisan newspapers. And the Founding Fathers were very worried that these partisan newspapers were going to tear the country apart and fill people's minds with false information. That was something that George Washington was very worried about. You might call it the 18th century version of fake news. He was very worried about it. And so what happens is, if you take one example, George Washington's feud with James Monroe. James Monroe had served as Washington's minister to France during the end of Washington's presidency. And during Washington's post-presidency, James Monroe writes what essentially amounts to a tell-all book attacking George Washington's foreign policy decisions. And you can see Washington reading this book back at his Mount Vernon home, writing angry annotations in the margin. He so wants to respond to what Monroe has written, attacking his name, but he can't do so because he knows he doesn't want to enter the fray himself.
So there was some resistance of doing this more publicly. Jonathan, is that something we could take away, that there were tensions and Washington was still very active, but did he temper that with being publicly antagonistic or aggressive towards current lawmakers at the time?
Right, he couldn't lash out that way. There was no Twitter, and had there been Twitter, George Washington would never have used Twitter. He was very concerned about the way his words were taken, and he was very careful when he spoke. Even at his own dinner table, he had the mindset that someone could repeat what he said, and those words would live on forever and make it into the history books. So he always had to be on guard. So I think we can say, had Twitter existed, George Washington would not have been a fan of it. And so what happens essentially is he can't respond, but he wishes he could respond, and you can see him writing angry annotations. One of the fallouts with Thomas Jefferson is that letters Thomas Jefferson has written that people interpret as being about George Washington, as being an attacks on George Washington's reputation, actually leak into newspapers. And that happens during George Washington's retirement too. And he really can't. In some sense, you can say he wanted to respond, but he couldn't respond.
So, how did you uncover his thoughts if he wasn't responding publicly? And we know that, for example, President Washington and his wife Martha, all of their letters apparently were destroyed. So we don't really have a history of their relationship. How did you uncover this particular snapshot of his life?
That's a great question. And of course, the destruction of George and Martha Washington's letters is a real loss to history. Martha Washington burned them after George Washington died. And I think you can assume probably George Washington was okay with that being done. But we still have other marvelous letters that were written. And we can see some sense of George Washington's reaction to these various different things. As I said, take the Monroe tell-all book attacking George Washington's foreign policy. We can see George Washington's angry annotations in the margins of this book. You can see we have his copy of it. And so you can really see his anger. And the feud with Thomas Jefferson, well, we have some correspondence where George Washington is sort of saying what he would like to be able to say to Thomas Jefferson, but can't say to him publicly. So we do have this snapshot, and the letters that people wrote during the 18th century are beautiful letters that are difficult for us to understand today because so much of letter writing is a lost art. But George Washington was a very effective letter writer.
So how would you describe him then in retirement? If you can paint the picture we have is him rocking on his porch. How would you paint the picture of him in his retirement, in his final years?
I would paint a picture of someone who knows that their legacy depends on giving up control of matters, but is struggling to actually do it. You can imagine him as having been the captain of a ship with his hand on the wheel, and now he's struggling to take his hand off the wheel of the ship of state. And it's very difficult because he's the one who set the ship afloat.
Did he struggle with that at all, Jonathan, about whether or not he should step officially back into a leadership role in America?
He did really struggle. He knew his legacy as the American Cincinnatus had depended on leaving the presidency. In fact, he had wanted to leave the presidency after one term as president, but he had been convinced that he needed to stay for a second. And by the time he finished his second, there was really no argument in the world that could have convinced him to stay for a third. And so when this offer to command the armies of the United States comes about a year after his retirement, he is very mixed. He's worried. What will people say if he accepts command? Will they think that everything he had previously said about wanting to give up command was a fraud? And could he do something that will hurt the legacy that he has left? And I think you just need to understand how important the word legacy was to George Washington. He had a real sense of his place in history, and he didn't want to do anything at this stage in his life to damage that place in history.
So let's just go back to a moment with that situation with John Adams, when John Adams asked George Washington to again be commander-in-chief of the military at the time. Did President Washington actually assume that role again in a very active sense, or did the threat from France sort of peter out, if you will?
That's a fantastic question, and he doesn't really ever take the field, as we might say. The war with France really remains it never becomes an official war. It's what we call today a quasi-war. It was fought mainly between ships at sea, and there was never an invasion of the United States, as some people feared might happen. George Washington himself couldn't really imagine the French could ever bring an army across the Atlantic Ocean and invade the United States. So the threat does, in fact, go away. But one of the things that's important to understand is that Washington had put conditions on his acceptance. And one of the conditions was he didn't want to take the field unless an invasion actually happened. And that's what made the choice of second in command so important. And when Washington chose Hamilton, you can see why Adams didn't want Hamilton having that job, because if Washington wasn't going to be in the field, the second in command was going to have effective control over the army.
It's so interesting. I'm reflecting back on the Senate tradition every year on President's Day to read President Washington's farewell address. So this was his final statement before he does retire. He steps away from the presidency and goes to Mount Vernon. And in that farewell address, he's really talking about how important it is for the Union to stay together. And just hearing you talk about the threats from France, I think it's so easy to forget that immediately upon the founding of America, it was threatened right away, from the outside. And so these men that were so responsible for helping it get off the ground knew that those threats were percolating, always on the horizon. And I can't imagine what that was like. It would be hard to sit back and try to retire when everything you fought for is constantly being threatened in some way, either internally or from the outside.
I think that's perfectly put, and it's important for context to understand that this stage of the United States' development, it really was a fledgling republic, and the two great superpowers in the world are Great Britain and France. And Great Britain and France are at war, and the American people themselves are divided on who to support. The Republican Party, which is different from our Republican Party today, but this emerging Republican Party, which really comes about as an opposition force to George Washington's administration, really favors the French. And Washington, in his farewell address, of course, had famously urged Americans to pursue their own interests. and not to be pro-French or be pro-British, but to be pro-American.
I mean, these are very similar themes, I think, that we're still confronting, isn't it? It must have been interesting for you, Jonathan, to go step back in time so far and see so many things that are sort of reminiscent or still public debates today.
That is very true. And one of the things that was so interesting is that so many of the things that people back then were worried about are the very things that we're worried about today. But in the end, that gave me a lot of confidence in our future as a country, because if we survive those challenges then, it means we can survive them today too.
That actually gives me a lot of hope. I need to hear that every once in a while. I think we all do, don't we, Jonathan? What is the one thing, if you can sum it up, I'm sure in all the many pages of your book and all the research that you've done, there's a lot to think about. But if you could sum it up for us, what is something that you learned about President Washington that you would like us all to consider as we remember his legacy on his birthday?
That's a great question. And the thing I think I would like people to take away from this book is that I would like people to appreciate how difficult it was for George Washington to give up power, to take his hand off the wheel of the ship of state. And only by appreciating how difficult that was can you have a true appreciation for what makes George Washington such an incredibly great person in history.
Jonathan, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, smarter news, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing smarter.